Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome all of you to this evening's event. Our guest tonight is James Kirchick, who has just flown from Washington. I hope you're not too jet-lagged. James Kirchick is a journalist and a foreign correspondent based in Washington, but he spent a long time in Europe and reporting from Europe, but also from other parts of the world, before publishing the End of Europe, his first book, which is just out with Yale University Press. You can also buy a copy in the room next door. Before publishing his first book, he worked first as a journalist for the New Republic, covering domestic politics, lobbying, intelligence, American foreign policy. Later, after the New Republic, he joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, reported from over 20 countries, and was based in Prague. Right now, he's, apart from touring Vienna and other places, promoting the book and developing the argument from the book and discussing the arguments from the book. He's also a correspondent for the Daily Beast and a columnist for the Tablet. His discussant this evening will be Ivan Vejvoda, who is a permanent fellow here at the IWM. He's in charge of our new research project about the future of EU. So I guess it's a very good match. Before coming to us, before coming and moving to Vienna, he was senior research director at the German Martian Fund of the United States. James, Ivan, let me welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is the first stop of my European book tour, so I'm very delighted to be here. So I should just be clear at the outset, this is a very pro-European book. I know some people were alarmed at the title. And the reason I wrote it is because I'm very concerned about what is happening here. And I think that the results of the American election only exacerbate my concerns about the future of Europe. And the way the book is organized is it's 8 chapters. Each looks at a different country and examines a particular crisis that affects the whole of Europe through the prism of a particular country's experience. And so the chapter on NATO and Russia is based in Estonia, and the chapter on Hungary is about historical revisionism and illiberal democracy, and so on and so forth. And so I think it provides a pretty holistic look at the various crises that the continent is facing. And I think it's based upon, 3 assumptions that I think we had about the West in general, but Europe in particular, that are now being challenged and being overturned, you might say. And the first assumption was that democracy would be sort of the permanent feature of the Western world. The second, I would say, is that economic prosperity in some form of regulated market capitalism would also be widely accepted and lead to ever-increasing gains. And the third was that security would be assured, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the gradual integration of Central and Eastern Europe into the EU and NATO, that there would never be war again on the European continent. And I think all 3 of these assumptions are being directly challenged, and certainly in the last case with what's going on in Ukraine, just completely and utterly repudiated. Now what I mean by the title of The End of Europe, it's not something so drastic as the disintegration of the EU as an institution or a catastrophic war like we've seen before. I think it's something, although I would say those are obviously possible, I think what I'm referring to is something more ethereal, and that might actually happen with us out even noticing it happening, which is the slow, gradual reversion to a system approximating the pre-integrationist model of Europe before the EU started, where we have the coming to power of nationalist governments that are amoral, that don't stand for values or principles on which the transatlantic community is based on, that are increasingly illiberal, and that are, in respect to Russia, are utterly transactional in their approach to dealing with Moscow. Countries that are acting independently of one another as opposed to together. I think this is a real possibility. I think in America we've actually already have it, frankly, in the election of Donald Trump. We have precisely the sort of leader that Vladimir Putin would like to see in every European country. To get back to the three assumptions and why they're off, I guess, well, democracy, we see, in neighboring Hungary, we actually have a full frontal, open, explicit rejection of liberal democracy. And it seems to be contagious in Poland, with the Polish government basically adopting some of the same measures that have been adopted in Hungary. When it comes to the prosperity, there's been near zero growth in the Eurozone, maybe 1% in a good year, over the past 7 or 8 years since the crash, and there's not much hope in sight. And certainly on the security question, which I think is the main threat to Europe, is Russia, which is not just waging an actual hot kinetic war in Ukraine. I actually think is waging a non-violent war against European liberal democracy through support of far-right, or in some cases far-left political movements, through disinformation, through hacking and leaking. I think what you saw in America is the template for what you will see in France, and especially in Germany, where I think the Russians have been waging a psychological operation, disinformation campaign against Angela Merkel, I would say dating back to 2013, even with the Snowden revelations. And that's what the chapter on Germany is about. And this comes with all these crises happening now on the continent. The American election could not really come at a worse time, or the results could not be worse for Europe. Because for the past 75 years, regardless of who the president was, you had a fairly consistent policy towards Europe on the basic question of European integration, or the notion that Europe should be politically cohesive. Certainly during the Cold War, that was the policy of Democratic and Republican presidents and Konrad Adenauer. And then after the Cold War, through George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, even Barack Obama, it was about expanding this political community and integrating the new Europe into the European Union. Now we have a president who is openly dismissive of Europe as an idea, the European Union as an institution, who has openly supported Brexit and has called for, and I'm quoting him, Brexit plus plus plus. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but we can probably divine it. His senior political advisor is a man named Stephen Bannon, who has said, and I'm quoting him, that nationalist governments make good neighbors. And I'm not sure what history of Europe he's reading to come to that conclusion. But this is a man with a very defined political agenda who really has the president's ear. And to the extent that this White House will be able to speed along the disintegration of Europe, to provide sustenance and support to far-right political parties, I think they will do it. And I think the meeting last week in the White House, absolutely shameful treatment of the German Chancellor by Donald Trump, I think is what we have to expect and what we should expect over the coming months and, dare I say, years. And on top of that, we also have, so while Donald Trump and this new administration is supporting disintegration from within by supporting these narratives and these political movements and these sort of disintegrative phenomena, from without, we may be seeking a rapprochement with the Russians. So we'll be threatening European unity from within and European unity from without, possibly, because the president seems to want to pivot back to the Middle East, to cooperate with the Russians in Syria, and I shudder to think at what might be sacrificed in exchange for that, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's something even deeper or graver, I don't know. The comments that the president has made about NATO, the first U.S. president to not explicitly come out in defense of Article 5, the collective security guarantee. This is a really devastatingly important developments in geopolitics to have a U.S. president not stand squarely behind the NATO alliance. On that optimistic note, I think I'll hand it over to you. But
Thank you very much, Jamie, for those introductory remarks and giving the broad brush description of how you go about tackling this issue. And I'm also very glad that up front you described this was a pro-European book in spite of the title. That was going to be my first question, but I think we've dispensed with that. But we'll come back to especially the dark times and others. But let me say that in 4 days' time in Rome, the leaders of the European Union will meet without Theresa May, she's skipping, to commemorate and celebrate 60 years of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And of course, it's also roughly 70 years since the coal and steel community. And it's also the anniversary of 70 years of the Marshall Plan.
Yep.
So all that you just described, I think, talks about the solidarity and the key link between the United States and Europe across the Atlantic, and of course the indispensable relationship in security terms, but also in economic terms. And I hope we can get to that also later. How does a Trump administration deal with that issue? Of course, he keeps lambasting Germany about the trade surplus, but anyone who has looked at the elementary statistics of trade and mutual investment and job creation, I think that as Chancellor Merkel was preparing her talking points, I think it came out that Germany alone creates 700,000 jobs in the United States through its investments. The mutual investments between the Netherlands and the United States is anything that's incomparable to what, for example, the U.S. invests in China and vice versa. So I have likened it over the years to the oxygen we breathe. We're not aware of it, but if someone shuts off the supply, we realize how much we depend on it. And I think there's either there's a lack of awareness or wanting to hide this fact, but in the end, it will come to that. You simply cannot cut off the oxygen between Europe and the United States. So that's a general backdrop I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of, even as the pivot to Asia happened and whatever else we've been discussing.
Can I interject something?
Sure, absolutely.
I think all those facts you said are totally right, and they make absolute sense to you and me. But I think if there's something we've learned over the past year, it's that facts often are irrelevant and that feelings matter more. And you mentioned Brexit, and I think a lot of people who voted for Brexit, I think there's been this sort of, I oppose Brexit, but I do think there's been this sort of elite condescension towards the people who voted for it, saying that they didn't know what they were going to lose. I think a lot of them did, and a lot of them said, you know what, sovereignty, quote unquote, whatever that word means, this is more important than, X number of jobs lost, trade. You can go down the whole list. The fact that everyone from the governor of the Bank of England to David Beckham opposed Brexit. I think a lot of people who voted for Brexit knew this. Yes. And there was this sort of idea of sovereignty that they wanted to regain. And I think similarly with Trump, I think a lot of people voted based on instinct, based on feeling. And this is maybe a new, it's not new. People have always, been guided by their feelings perhaps more than rational decisions. But I think that's something that, I want to think that you're right when it comes to the trading relationship with Europe, and that, sort of the rude facts of reality will dawn on this administration and convince them that it doesn't make sense to start a trade war with Germany. But when you believe something really strongly, and you've been saying it for decades, like Donald Trump has with regards to protectionism. This is one of the oldest, when people say that Donald Trump doesn't believe in anything, there's a few things he does believe in. And the notion that America is getting ripped off by its allies or by the international system, by free trade. This is something he has been remarkably consistent upon for 30 years. And so
I agree with you,
Yeah.
and in fact, as you probably know, the British historian Bernard Sims has written this small book. He's looked at all the interviews that Trump has done since the 1980s,
Yes.
and that comes out,
Yes.
these few things on security, on trade, where
Yes.
he's very consistent. It's
Yes.
not at all haphazard. I can only underscore what you said, coming from the former Yugoslavia and having lived through the breakdown and disappearance of my country, that, for example, when Slovenians were told by their own economists, we will take a 30% hit on our standard of living, it didn't matter. It was all, as you say, about sovereignty
Or even
and identity.
the velvet divorce
Yeah.
between Czech Republic and Slovakia. I think actually the majority of the people didn't even want it. It was sort of the
No, they didn't.
It was the political elites conspiring, and it just happened. And things happen sometimes.
So, I mean, the latest news today on your point is that Secretary of State Tillerson will not go to the NATO meeting ministerial. He will go to Russia, probably.
Yep.
And I think that's very indicative for a Secretary of State not missing, actually, a major transatlantic meeting. But, you come in a kind of long line of people who have worried about the future of Europe, as we all do as common folk. I was just reminding myself that Tony Judd wrote a book in 1996 about Europe called The Grand Illusion. Krzysztof Michalski, the founder of this institute, in 2006 had a conference on the soul of Europe, where I was looking at the introduction. He says, Europe has never been challenged the way it is right now. That was 10 years ago. He, of course, did unfortunately not live to see, the kind of triple crisis that he, I guess, didn't suspect would come. And then others are putting in question this construct. So we'll try and dig deeper into the reasons, but I think, as we were saying just before we came down, there's a sort of perfect storm that occurred globally, and Europe is a kind of microcosm of that global challenge that we are witnessing. I lived in the States, taught for 2 years in 96, 98, and with my wife, when we arrived there in August, there was a handyman electrician who came in, this was in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, who said to us, I do not know where my children will find work. This was 20 years ago. Factories were already being closed, going to Mexico, outsourcing to China. And I was just reminded that the first polls in Europe after the French referendum against Europe in 2005, Nicole Gnesotto said that this was the first time in opinion polls that French were saying, our children will not live better than I. Can you comment a bit about this trend of leaders actually not responding to the downtrodden, forgotten losers of globalization, and the bubble that has occurred not only in Washington but in other places, Brussels, but also capitals, where somehow the fair weather made people oblivious to the fact that there were actually people who were losing out slowly for 20 years from this example from Minnesota.
Well, I'm definitely a member of that bubble. I mean, I live in the Washington, D.C., and I'm a citizen of the Amtrak corridor to New York, and the election came as a shock to me, and it definitely taught me that I need to learn more about my own country. And it was sort of strange with this book coming out, and I realized, I think I know more about Europe than I do my own country, and I probably need to spend more time in these parts of America that I've never visited before. With regards to the pessimism, I'm often asked, particularly in America, there's lots of concerns about sort of the demographic decline of Europe and the fact that Europeans are not reproducing to replacement levels, and it can often take a quite alarmist tone. And they say, well, how do you avert this, or how do you fix this? And I say, I actually think this is more of a consequence of this pessimism. Because I think if you look at a society, there's probably no greater indicator of societal optimism than reproduction, right? I mean, if you're not reproducing, you're probably not very optimistic about the future of your country. You don't want to bring a child into a world where you don't think that they will succeed. And so I think the answer to this question, how is the demographic problem of Europe going to be solved? I think you need to solve these other problems first. You need to solve or at least come up with some sort of alternative to the current policies that would allow Europeans to think, well, my children will have a brighter future than I do. I think this is the great question, really, is how do we maintain employment at the levels that we need to with automation and all these technological changes, driverless cars, all these things that are going to put unskilled people out of work. And those are the constituencies that tend already to vote for populist parties. And the more that this problem goes unaddressed, the more I think you'll see the rise of these populist parties. I'm not an economist. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is probably at the crux of this question.
Well, that's exactly the way that I feel that the uncertainty that pervades the Western world writ large is a collusion of several elements. One is the one that you actually just mentioned. I mean, at least for the past 3-4 years, the fourth technological revolution has dictated titles in newspapers which said in Europe about 50% of jobs can be replaced by robots or digitalization. And so if you have a job in Europe, you must ask yourself the question, well, will I have it in whatever, 5 years' time? And if I don't have it, will I ever have it again? And then on top of that, you get the migration, refugee, tsunami, the way that people perceive it. I mean, for a European Union of 500 million, 1.5 million, we admittedly say is not serious. But the way that it happened in an uncontrolled way, and a German Bundestag member told me, he said, Ivan, you must understand there's a sense of panic in this country. So even in Germany, where you have full employment and good salaries, so the outlook for the future looks bad, uncertain. You're fearful that you'll be simply submerged by a wave of people, and then on top of that you have the identity issue. And what does that wave then do to us as a nation?
I am more sympathetic to that fear in Europe because the economies are the unemployment levels are higher, the economies are overregulated, so it makes it more difficult to integrate migrants when they come in. Obviously, automation is more responsible for the fact that people are losing jobs. It's not migrants taking their jobs.
Yeah, exactly.
But and also the cultural factor, I do think is a serious one. I think there are deep questions about Islam in Europe and how can we assimilate Muslim immigrants. In America, this is why I'm still astounded by the election. You wouldn't know it listening to Donald Trump, but there has been net emigration over the Mexican border over the past 6 years. More people were leaving over that border than were coming over. So, but listening to him, you would think it was the complete opposite. Second of all, our immigrants from that part of the world assimilate pretty darn well, certainly better than Moroccans do in France. And so it sort of escaped me why there was this cultural fear that he was obviously playing on, because we are a multi-ethnic society by our very basis, and we've just done I think we do, probably next to Canada, we do one of the best jobs of assimilating people. So I didn't, and on top of that, again, the reason for these job losses in the Rust Belt places was not because jobs are going to China or Mexico, it was because of automation. So these three things were just factually wrong, and I didn't understand how people could, make a determination to vote for this man based upon these three pretty big whopping lies. But again, it sounds comforting, or it sounds easy, it sounds right. Build the wall. Latinos are not really Americans, which he seemed to imply when he attacked the judge who was ruling in the Trump University case, and he said, well, he won't be fair because he's Latino, which is such a this is such a fundamental attack on the notion of what it means to be an American, to say that because someone is of a Latino or whatever background, if they're Jewish or Chinese or whatever, to say that ipso facto, because of this, they cannot be a part of our community is such a strike against what it means to be an American. And he was condemned for that by a lot of people, but again, seemed to have no effect. And then on the job loss stuff, with the reason why most of these jobs are going overseas is because of automation. But to engage in a trade war with China and to build a wall, it sounds, I don't know, it makes people feel good, or it makes them feel that this can be a solution.
Yeah, I mean, on the job issue, and that's why I mentioned this 1996 example of this electrician who, sees, and, in my perception, you have this part of the population who votes in presidents consecutively, hoping that someone will address this issue in some compensation, some kind of schemes, and nothing happens, right? And then this resilience, and resilience is really the buzzword, both in the EU global strategy and others. And I think it is an important fact of people do find ways how to survive and fend for themselves, even as they see challenges coming along. But after 20 years, there comes this person called Trump, and who says, well, actually, I'm hearing you, that you haven't been catered for. And all the economic statistics showing that the average salary has at best remained level, if not declined, whereas the 1%, the inequality has risen. And you get this situation where, in a period of peace, it's actually the internal social and economic dynamics that produce this turnover. So, trying to come back to Europe, but obviously we can't extricate ourselves from the transatlantic, I would simply like to ask you to reflect on something that I posed rhetorically as, what does it mean to have lived 60 or 70 years in peace? What kind of internal social dynamics does it create when a younger generation, thank God, doesn't know the experience of war, even through their parents?
Right.
And everything's been fair weather, and there's been a teleology where, we don't have to worry, as you said, no more wars, and, we'll live happily ever after.
With the exception, of course, of 9/11, which was a very traumatic experience. But even then...
And the breakdown of Yugoslavia in 1990.
And the breakdown of Yugoslavia. But even then, in terms of 9/11, you did not have a draft. It was not, every American male of 18 had to go fight a war. I mean, we were all, for the most part, really untouched by that, even though it was a very traumatic experience. There's a poll that's often been cited that showed, it's the World Values Survey, and it shows that 27% of millennials in America, only 27%, consider living in a democracy to be essential, which is astounding when you think of it, really. That this is something that they really, really, literally take for granted. Because we've been blessed to grow up in a country where we've never had to worry about these things. And obviously our Ukrainian friends have a completely different experience because they're fighting and dying for it. And the numbers for the Europeans weren't that higher. It was only, I think, 40% of Europeans in the millennial category considered living in a democracy to be essential. So I think there's been a forgetting of history, or a failure to transmit the lessons of history. In the case of Hungary, it's a deliberate, as I just detail in the book, it's a deliberate whitewashing and lying about history. And that's happening in other places in Europe too, as well. Certainly in Russia, I think the relationship to history plays a huge role in that country's foreign policy. The fact that Stalin is a leader who is venerated as opposed to condemned. I mean, what kind of lesson or message does that send to the Russian people about their country's history and about their relationship to their neighbors? You contrast it with Germany, which is a country that I think we can all learn from, certainly Americans can learn from, about how they approach their history. None of Germany's neighbors fear it. They all send their children there to learn German. They want more economic and cultural exchanges. Why can't that be a future for Russia? I think every one of Russia's neighbors, I don't think you could say that there's one neighbor of Russia who enjoys the experience of being a neighbor of Russia. I think they all live in fear of that country, and I think a lot of it has to do with this history. And I think a lot of our failures in the West to deal with Russia are because of a sort of overconfidence and a belief in this sort of teleology of history, and that we figured that once the Cold War ended, we could, certainly Americans, that we could just sort of wipe our hands and move on to other parts of the world and leave this part. It was settled, it was done. And clearly it wasn't. And I don't think we still have come to grips with how dangerous this Russian regime is and what it is that they're seeking to do. I mean, whether it was President Obama, who barely a month in office decided to start his reset just right after the Russians invaded and occupied Georgia with barely a slap on the wrist, going through years of this reset with numerous violations on the INF Treaty, all sorts of things. And now it's amazing that after the past 8 years of what we've known about Vladimir Putin and what they've been doing in Ukraine and the military buildup and what they did in our own election, to see another American president think that he can have a nice relationship with Vladimir Putin. Trump always says, well, wouldn't it be nice to get along with Russia? And, of course it would be nice to get along with Russia. It would be nice to get along with North Korea. The reason we don't get along with them is because of the nature of the regimes that control these countries. And so I think, there's a lot of history in this book and in writing about interpretations of history and how we understand history, because I think that is so fundamental to the current state that we're in.
I think that's one of the great virtues of your book, Jamie, is that there's been a forgetting of history, and that Europeans, as we are in my generation, and I think in some others, have been taught those lessons, that Europe has been many times in the ashes, but it has come out of those ashes. Yeah, admittedly very painfully. The cost has been huge over the centuries, and yet somehow it's found it in itself to do that. And I think there's been a lot of doom and gloom about Europe, and having lived in Washington for the past 6 years, Europe is collapsing every 6 months, either because of the euro crisis or whatever other reason. And yet, and there's also been this simplistic analysis that with Brexit and Trump, now we'll have many Brexits and many Trump effects throughout Europe. So to kind of reverse course here, and on the brighter side, we have had positive developments in this country.
Sure.
The election of President van der Bellen 2 times in a row,
yes,
which is quite unprecedented.
I thought he lost the first time. Oh, he
no,
won
no,
the first
he
time.
won.
Oh, okay.
He won. He won. Everybody talked about the small margin by which he won, which was 31,000 votes, if I'm right. But for me, the bigger number was he came back from a 25% lag 2 months before he elected. So he made up 25%, then went over, and then very convincingly won in December. The Dutch election, Prime Minister Rutte routed Geert Wilders. What I want to say with these 2 examples is that it seems that Brexit in particular, and then Trump, and this was demonstrated in an opinion poll that the Bertelsmann Foundation did after these 2 events, there's been a kind of, wait a minute, where is this leading us? Are we sure that we want to follow down this line? Yeah. And my goodness, as a smaller, medium-sized European country, are we sure that we want to reverse course? And suddenly I think that the hard drive of history kind of reminds you, why are we here? And so all those lessons that were learned in post-war Europe have come back. And then there's a kind of popular movement now called Pulse of Europe, in particular in Germany and other countries, where people over the past 3 or 4 Sundays have come out into the squares of Europe and have, I think this is new, when you criticize Europe before you were kind of taxed as Eurosceptic. Right. Now you can criticize Europe and be pro-European, namely, we need to fix things in Brussels. How do you see this kind of reverse dynamic now.
Well, I think there's maybe two potential Trump effects. There's the one where Europeans look at this and say, this is just crazy. We can't do this. It's chaos. It's nuts. We don't want any part of it. On the other hand, there's, well, you know what? America can't afford to do this because they're the leader, or the titular leader of the free world. But, we're the Czech Republic, we're Slovakia. It's not going to be the end of the world if we nominate our own Trump. And I think you're already kind of seeing that logic, certainly in the Czech Republic, where there is sort of a Trumpian figure on the horizon who may become prime minister of that country. So there's two different ways that this could fall out. I wouldn't read too much into the election results in a country like Holland, just because I think, or the Netherlands, excuse me, because it's small and obviously the particularities of each country are, all politics is local, as a great American politician once said. And because I'm such a pessimist, the way I look at it is, yes, Geert Wilders didn't get as many votes as people thought he would, but he did get more votes than he did last time. And Marine Le Pen will most likely not become president of France, but you know what? She's going to double what her dad got, if not more, when he ran. So there's a part of me that sees this sort of inexorable, slow drift towards what I call the end of Europe. That we need to arrest it, and it's a question of time, really, because I do think that from Brexit to Le Pen to what's happening in Eastern Europe with Poland and Hungary, the way the cars are moving down the road does not look good.
No, I agree. Well, first of all, having lived and studied in France, I'm sure that Le Pen will not win,
Yeah.
and that Angela Merkel and Scholz in some combination will win. But of course, and you're absolutely right to point that out, the issues won't go away.
Right.
Whether it's migration or fear of terrorism or fear about future of jobs. So what would be your recommendation to Europe and Europeans of how to deal with it? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about lack of leadership, and that's clear.
Yeah.
I mean, Britain has been missing in action. France
Yeah.
has been missing in action. Poor Mutti has, had to deal herself with these things reluctantly because Germany fully understands that it cannot lead alone,
Yeah.
and it mustn't lead alone. So there's a necessity for working with others, but somehow the others are not stepping up to the plate.
I mean, I see the main threats to Europe at this now as being external. And the two main security threats, I think, are Russia, which, as I said, is basically waging a nonviolent war to subvert the West. And they've succeeded in the United States to the degree that it was Russian influence that, got Trump elected. I think it was probably minimal, but they still tried it and they got away with it. And they got the result that they wanted. And I'm worried that this hybrid war that we read so much about, these sorts of shadowy tactics of money and influence peddling and disinformation and hacking and leaking, I worry about the long-term corrosive effect that this has. And I can already see it. Every time Donald Trump opens his mouth, he is corroding American democracy and American discourse. And there's no law that can stop him from doing that. He just gets up and talks. And he uses the bully pulpit. And every day he is making, the world's greatest democracy look foolish. And he's making democracy look foolish. If this is what happens in the world's greatest democracy, then what does that say about democracy? And this is the reason why I think Putin wanted Trump to win. I don't think there's all these conspiracy theories going around. Was he recruited in the 80s? There's that dossier with the weird sexual stuff? Is there money swishing around that we don't know about? I think the answer is clear. I think Donald Trump makes America not look like a world leader that you would want to trust. And I think that was the ultimate reason for it. So Russia is the external threat. And so the issue of migration over the long haul is going to be a very serious problem. And so I think if I had to tell Europeans to get their act together on one thing, it would be a cohesive, coherent, common foreign policy. And that means you need to have a common energy policy to wean yourself off of Russian gas and oil. That means you need to have a common Russia policy on sanctions and diplomatic approach to dealing with the Russians. And it means you need a neighborhood policy in North Africa and the Middle East so that you can address these problems at their root, so that you're not dealing with the consequences of them in the form of massive numbers of migrants who are coming and are fueling the rise of these illiberal populist movements. So that, and this will probably be unpopular, I think Europeans need to liberalize their economies. I think the reason why a country like France is in the economic doldrums, or Greece, I don't blame that on the euro. I don't blame that on European integration. I blame that on bad economic policies pursued by successive French and Greek governments. And I think the youth unemployment in a country like France, I mean, we talked earlier about Brexit. There was a huge divide between the youth voting against Brexit and older people voting for Brexit. In France, Marine Le Pen polls the highest among young people in France, which is totally contradictory to what you would think, that young people would be voting for the far-right populist party. But because their economic prospects are so bad, and because youth unemployment in France is whatever it is, 35, 40%, they're falling for her kind of false promises. And so, you know, my solution as an American would be to encourage entrepreneurship, to loosen up the labor laws. And I know that this is very, very difficult to do in a country like France, but I don't see how they get out of this until they do reform.
Before I open it up to the audience, let me ask you about the effect of the U.S. security blanket over Europe for so many years. And you know, I don't want to say that you're letting European leaders off the hook too easily by the external threats, but I really do think that there's been a complacency by the EU leadership of being navel-gazing in a good and not so good way, in the sense that if you just take Syria, I mean, Syria is literally across the street. And so the house is burning there, and you're kind of going to your work every day and don't care. And, you know, wishing that, you know, the fire will go out by itself,
I think Mr. Obama deserves a lot of blame for that, because if I recall correctly, the French government and the British government were ready to go. They had their jets on the tarmac. And Barack Obama hung them out to dry. So I think Barack Obama, I think there's actually a lot of consistency between Barack Obama's foreign policy and the emerging Trump foreign policy that a lot of Obama supporters would be dread to acknowledge. But I think there is, particularly with regards to Russia and with regards to sort of a retrenchment of American power and influence, I think there's actually a lot in common. Trump comes at it from a completely different ideological perspective. He's very belligerent about it. It's all America first. Whereas Obama is was sort of a utopian universalist. But the outcome of these two, you know, ideological views of America's role in the world are not, there's differences, but they're more similar than I think either side would be willing to admit. As to the question of Europeans and their security, absolutely. Look, when the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize a couple years ago, I thought that was great. I thought maybe NATO was equally deserving. I think Europeans, I think Americans don't appreciate enough the importance of European integration to Europeans. I think we don't. A lot of Americans look at the EU, and we're informed in this view by sort of our British cousins that it's this monstrous bureaucracy that tells you what size your pickles should be and whatnot. And on the other hand, and that's false, I don't agree with that viewpoint. On the other hand, I think a lot of Europeans don't take into account that the precondition for European integration was the American security blanket. You would not have had a European coal and steel community. You would not have an EU if you didn't have the fact that it was America that was the unchallenged, you know, military hegemon on the continent, because that neutralized all the other sort of security competition that would have taken place between the various European countries. But yes, absolutely, I think Europeans need to spend more on defense. Every president has said this. I don't, you know, I guess I agree with Donald Trump that European countries should spend more. I don't like the way he's going about doing it, obviously. I think it's completely counterproductive. But absolutely, I think, yeah, absolutely, Europeans need to spend more on defense.
And that if there's a silver lining to the Trump victory, it's the fact that Europeans have woken up to the fact they need to do much more on security and defense. And actually, having been in close contact with Natalie Tocci, who wrote the global strategy for Mrs. Mogherini, you know, the whole approach is we really need to be more strategic rather than sitting and waiting for all the crises to come to us and then do crisis management.
I think this is I think there's almost a sort of weird post-Marshall sensibility in Europe that people they took pride in their humanitarianism towards the refugees, and that was wonderful. You should feed and clothe your neighbor. But it was almost like it was solely their humanitarian response that they took pride in, and the very notion that there might be a Marshall response to this, that maybe the solution lied in jets and bombs, was so kind of, particularly after Libya, I think was maybe so difficult for Europeans to grasp. And this goes back to, Bob Kagan and Europeans are from Venus and we're from Mars and whatnot, but I think there is something to that critique.
Okay, well, we have 40 minutes. I'll open it up, and we have a first question right there. Just wait for the microphone, please. And please do introduce yourselves.
Paul Leifer, I'm a retired Austrian civil servant. I have actually 3 questions. The first question is, you said this was a pro-European book. I haven't heard anything that would substantiate this claim. And I get the impression that Europe is like a frog in front of 2 snakes. Is that really realistic? And what can we realistically expect as a European reaction to all the threats that you have outlined? The second question is, I think you are dramatizing the role of Russia. How compatible is the rapprochement with Russia with America first? And the third question is, you have depicted the American society in a way that would make the world get frightened. My question also to my American friends that I have posed, and I'm posing to you, when are the checks and balances taking effect? Thank you
very much. Jamie.
I should say at the outset, I'm very pro-EU. I support it ideologically, I support it institutionally, I support its expansion. I came to this view, I should just be honest, I came to this view rather late. I was like a lot of American right-of-center people who viewed the EU as a potential competitor or strategic rival to the United States. And it wasn't until really living in Europe, in particular seeing the response to the Ukraine crisis, that I came to appreciate, you know what, actually Europe is more our partner than they are a strategic competitor, and unity and cohesion in dealing with these problems is of the utmost importance. And so I came around to it through my own personal experience, but I'm sorry if I sounded so pessimistic, but I'm a deep believer in the European project, which is particularly why I've been so flabbergasted and annoyed by my own president, because I see his complete and utter apathy, if not hostility, to Europe as so dangerous to the world order that, let's be honest, American soldiers fought and died for, and the Marshall Plan funded, and it would be such a waste to throw this all away, which is what he seems to want to do. And as to I actually disagree entirely. I think America First is entirely compatible with a rapprochement with Russia, because America First says America is not going to play a world leadership role like we used to. We're going to come home, and we're going to put up walls, we're going to put up trade barriers, and alliances are not important to us anymore. Donald Trump attacked Angela Merkel on the campaign trail by name more than any other world leader. It's true. That should say something. He attacked Japan and South Korea and Europe as a whole, or individual European countries. He has no appreciation for alliances and what those mean and how they have upheld peace and security in Europe or in Asia for the past 75 years. Part of that is ideological, I think, on his part. There is a strain in American political thought that has been America First, that has been sort of a nationalist, isolationist strain. It's never gotten this far, that we actually had a president who espouses it. It's always been there. Part of it, I think, is also a function, frankly, of his disordered personality. I don't think Donald Trump has friends, real friends. They're all business partners or people hangers on, and so he doesn't understand why sometimes you'll have a relationship with a country and there'll be a trade imbalance, and how that could actually be good for both of you. It's all zero sum. If Germany is getting something good out of our relationship, well, then it must mean that we're getting something bad out of it. That's how he views the world. It's very simplistic. And so to that point, If he's America first, that means that, you know what, Eastern and Central Europe, that's not our concern. That is Russia's backyard. That's their sphere of influence. America first gives us the Western Hemisphere. And Putin would be completely happy with this. A sphere of influence. You Americans, you can take the Western Hemisphere like the old Monroe Doctrine. Let us take our traditional former empire. So I think America first is absolutely entirely compatible with a rapprochement with Russia. And as for the checks and balances, I actually think that the checks and balances are working fine. I mean, he tried to do this travel ban. It was struck down by the courts. It's going back and forth, but it's certainly working. I'm actually much less concerned about Donald Trump's effect on my own country domestically than I am internationally. Because unlike in America, where we have a Congress and a Supreme Court, there's no equivalent of that in the global political scenario. There's no global Supreme Court that can say, Donald Trump, what you're trying to do here is illegal. Or there's no. I mean, I'm sorry. The United Nations General Assembly is not going to stop Donald Trump from doing dangerous and disastrous things. So I'm actually much more concerned about his effect on the world than I am my own country.
Okay, question back there.
Thank you. My name is Pierre Neuhon. I'm a Danish journalist and a commentator on European affairs through 50 years, as a matter of fact. I would like to thank you very much, first of all, for some very relevant remarks. I have no real criticism or complaints, not at all. I agree.
That's what I like to hear.
I agree a very long way. And concerning what you said here towards the end, I think one should be aware, though this was not really what I was preparing to say, one should be aware of the possibility that we could move on to a new 1939. Yeah. 1939, of course, where we had the agreement between Hitler and Stalin, dividing the world, or in that case, Europe. Now it could be the world. And I can easily see, I've also been writing it, that the two gentlemen there would agree to the degree where, I mean, America would get the Western Hemisphere, probably also Africa and large parts of Asia. And the Russians would take Europe as it is, which has been actually a goal for Russian politics since the defeat of Napoleon.
Yes.
But what I was really after, and I am not actually a deep pessimist on European affairs. I tend to see Europe as a 1,500-year-old political and cultural idea. And most of that time we have spent fighting each other. Only the last 60 years have we tried to move towards a united Europe. We have actually made enormous progress. Yes. Enormous progress. For the moment, we are in a valley. But I'm sure we will come back. And in a sense, what has happened in the United States might help. For the first time in these 60 years, the Europeans are feeling that they are alone. We have now to wake up and take care of our own affairs. And okay, we have had a very nice election in Austria. We have an excellent, decent president here. We came well out of the Dutch election. I am sure we will come well out of the French election. I am sure we will have a good election result in Germany. That means actually that for a while we will be out of the, shall we say, the tumult, the chaos that we have for the moment. That moment we should use, and there are indications, I believe, that we will use it by creating, for the first time, an integrated and, what would be the word in English? An integrated and convincing European military defense. The first signs are in the air. And if we had more sweet tones coming out of Washington, this would not be the case. This is actually, it could be, I would rather say, a defining moment for a European defense centered probably on the French nuclear armed forces and, of course, the German land forces. If we come to that, then Europe will be, so to say, free of the United States, and the United States would be free of Europe. I am not necessarily looking forward to that, but it could be of benefit, certainly, to Europe, that we finally learn to be on our own feet. And when I say Europe, I mean Europe from the Atlantic to the Russian border.
Yeah.
I am including Ukraine, White Russia, etc. It might not be the worst thing which is happening for the moment in Washington. It worries, but
it's not my ideal, but you may be right, because my fellow Americans seem that they're not as interested in Europe as they used to be. So you may be right.
Okay, so I have many questions. First one here.
How do you compare the Trump war with
I'm sorry.
My name is Mirjana Tomic. I used to be a journalist. Now I work for Forum Journalismus und Medien Wien. I train journalists and organize seminars for Austrian and Austria-based journalists. I have a very simple question. I'm old enough to know that Russian propaganda is not something new. I would like to ask you, why are they so successful now? Why weren't they successful before? Are they doing their job better? What is the difference? Yeah. Have you done a comparative analysis? Thank you.
I haven't done a comparative. I've thought a lot about this because, like I said, I was just taken aback at how persuasive it was in the United States, in that it mobilized both the left and the right. Let's remember the first leak that happened was of the DNC.
About Europe.
Oh, Europe.
The book was about Europe.
Yes, okay. Well, in general, I think the reason why it's more effective is because, look, during the Cold War, it was very clear who the enemy was. It was the Soviet Union, and it was Marxist-Leninist ideology. And you knew who its allies were. It was the local communist parties or fellow travelers. And it was, either you were on one side or you weren't. And now I think it's more complicated. And the narratives that they're using appeal to all different types of ideological communities. In particular, we'll go back to Hungary and Poland. We see steadfast, resolute people with real resolute anti-communist backgrounds, like Viktor Orban, who are maybe even unwittingly parroting these Russian narratives about a civilizational war with Islam that the Russians have been cultivating for years to bring on, to attract culturally and traditionally conservative constituencies onto their side. And that's something that wouldn't have happened 40 years ago. You wouldn't have had, proud, patriotic Catholic Poles aligning themselves with a Russian propaganda narrative to the extent that they are now. So I think the ideological terrain that we're on, and whatever you want to call this conflict, if it's a new Cold War, if it's a battle between liberal democracy and sort of authoritarian populism, if you even want to go that far, it's not as clear cut. The ideological boundaries are not as clear cut. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it's also building on a kind of social conservatism that exists in many societies.
Yes.
That Putin is standing for the traditional Christian family values of marriage and against LGBT and all of these things. You find that across America and Europe, and I think that's what Orban has also done. Okay, Ambassador. Right here.
Thank you. I just want to follow up basically on what has been said. Don't you think that you can reformulate it like Russia is building an alternative Europe, and this alternative Europe is appealing to many, many people in European societies, and it's surprising. It's actually something we didn't expect, but in future I don't know, a month ago, Anton Chekhov was actually reading a lecture here and saying that the dream of the European right was always Russia-oriented Europe and not America-oriented Europe. Yeah. So I personally don't believe this dream will come true, but so many things have been happening recently that we didn't believe in. What's your thought on this?
This touches earlier upon the question that the gentleman behind you asked that I neglected to answer. I don't want to sound like a paranoid where I'm attributing all of Europe's problems to the Russians. These are indigenous problems. I mean, Marine Le Pen would exist if there was no Russia. I mean, same with the FPÖ in this country and all sorts of, these are political movements that have long histories. Russia is exacerbating and exploiting them, but they are there. And I think we overestimated the extent to which the things that we all like would be, that everyone else would also like them. And you know what? Sometimes I think nationalism and sort of ethnic identity is just a much more powerful, to this day, in 2017, it is still a very powerful force. And it's not like we can just wave a wand and enlighten people to move beyond and think of themselves as citizens of the world or Europeans as opposed to whatever their distinct ideologies are. I mean, I saw that in my own country, which I thought had really transcended this sort of stuff. But we clearly didn't.
Okay, right at the very back. Yeah.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Perfect. My name is Jens. I'm a student. I don't have a question, but I have a request. You didn't touch upon one of the most recent and very pressing issues, which is the question of Turkey. Maybe you could discuss this topic a little bit?
I mean, I'm not an expert on Turkey, so I can't really, comment on the internal politics of it. I will say that the behavior of its government over the past couple of weeks, interfering and meddling in certain countries, is very counterproductive to what Erdogan says he wants, which is for Muslims and non-Muslims to get along. Whipping up his dual citizens in the Netherlands or Germany and exploiting these social cleavages that already exist in order to campaign so that he can become something closer to a dictator, I think is really destructive and irresponsible behavior. I thought the response of Prime Minister Rutte was entirely appropriate. And I thought he actually did a pretty good job of neutralizing an issue that could have been exploited by Mr. Wilders. And I thought he did a good job of dealing with that.
Absolutely. Next
My question also has to do with Turkey, which aspires to join the European Union. I think it has been a little bit alarming for those of us actually living here in the last couple of years to see a kind of muscular Turkish political demonstrations. So soon after the coup, I mean, even here in Vienna, the demonstrations took everyone by surprise.
Among the emigre community
yes,
living here. Yeah.
Yes, because there was the belief somehow that, that Turks were the Muslim minority who were well assimilated, weren't making any waves.
Right.
And this came as an extremely unpleasant surprise to the extent that anyone actually noticed it beyond, the few days after it happened. But what I want, so my question is, what do you think of Turkey's chances now? Has Erdogan given up wanting to join the EU? That was question number one. And two,
Yes.
to go back to the US, what do you see? I don't happen to see a reaction from the Republican Party to moderate this astonishing change from decades of American foreign policy. But I haven't been
Of Trump in general, you're saying,
yes.
yeah.
So those are the two questions. What are Turkey's chances? And two, what is the Republican Party doing? It seems to me nothing in response to this very great change.
As far as Turkey is concerned, to the extent that to be a member of the EU, you have to be a democracy with checks and balances and free press and all that. It doesn't seem that Mr. Erdogan is very interested. He seems to be doing everything to prevent that from happening. all the domestic measures that he's taking would not suggest that this is a man who is sincerely interested in bringing his country into the EU. That's just my outsider viewpoint. As for what the GOP is doing about Trump, I mean, with the exception of a handful of outspoken leaders like John McCain and Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio to an extent, it has been utterly slavish deference to the president. And there was a hearing yesterday that you could watch, the House Intelligence Committee, where they're investigating Russian interference in the election, and the Democrats were the only ones who were asking. They had testifying the head of the FBI, the head of the National Security Agency. It was only the Democrats who had asked questions about the actual issue of Russian interference in the election. All the Republicans wanted to talk about were the leaks from people in the government that singled out Mike Flynn as having these inappropriate conversations with the Russian ambassador. They could not care less about what Russia did. And they don't want to ask the question, and this is the real important thing. A lot of Republicans don't want to stop and ask the question, what is it about Donald Trump that persuaded Vladimir Putin that this was the guy to put his chips on and to support? What is it about his foreign policy and the way he behaved, and the way that he would present America as a world power? What is it about it that led Vladimir Putin and the Russians to want him to win? And I tried to explain that earlier because I think he presents a particular worldview that is a radical departure from decades of sort of engaged Republican foreign policy. It's kind of like, if you have a family member who's an alcoholic or is abusive and you have to stage an intervention, it's like necessary but painful. You have to do it. And I don't see Republicans showing any desire to do this. They would rather politicize this issue. They would rather say things like, oh, well, the Russian interference didn't affect anything. There's no way to say whether or not and why didn't Hillary campaign more in Wisconsin and Michigan? That's not the issue. The issue is the fact that the Russians did this. That should be the issue. Every patriotic American should be concerned with this. And there are precious few Republicans who are saying that.
But hasn't there been some pushback on the accusation that President Obama
yes,
when
it comes
from
to,
Republican
yes.
congressmen?
When it comes to the outrageous lies, like President Obama ordered the wiretapping of Trump Tower in the most, appalling thing, and then saying that the British did it at his behest, which led to this unprecedented statement from the British intelligence agency coming out saying, no, we didn't, and they never publicly comment about anything. When it comes to these outrageous lies, you will see Republican leaders sort of grudgingly say, yeah, the president's not telling the truth. But as far as sort of the broader strategic, like on the Russia issue, I don't see a lot of outspoken protest about the realignment with Russia, aside from these handful of people that I've spoken about.
Okay. There was a question somewhere in the back there. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief. First, a remark on Europe, because I'm European, and I would invite your comment. I think Europeans basically know very well what to do now, if they got the time to do it, if they got some space to maneuver, if you want to call it this. And what they have to do is become reasonable, set back a step, take a step or two back from utopian schemes, become economically reasonable,
yeah.
And that will do the trick. I think every responsible European politician knows that. Problem is that they don't, for political reasons, don't want to follow one of the Obama doctrines. That means, I think you put it in very vulgar terms. I think I screwed up. European politicians would never, in these days, admit that they screwed up on very important topics. The euro is one of them. It's a folly of sorts. We know that now, and every economist who is able to read a textbook on international macro can see that. So Europe has to get back to a reasonable. Has to get back to the drawing board, admit mistakes, and redesign some of its integration schemes. The second is a question on the US. There's a lot of course, a lot of talk about the present president, about the checks and balances, about the Republican Party. There is very little talk, however, about the failure of the Democratic Party to simply come up with an acceptable, trustworthy candidate. Even Paul Krugman, who I respect very much, doesn't want to admit that Mrs. Clinton was. Well, I shouldn't have a say on U.S. matters in that respect, but was less than ideal. Let's put it this way.
Yes.
And this explains, to a large extent, how a lobby-infested, plutocratic political scheme into which the U.S. tends to develop. I think it has in part developed into this kind of political setup, would run into an election result like the one we are faced with. Thank you.
One of the reasons not to read too much into Trump's election is because I think so much was contingent upon other factors, one of which was the fact that the Democrats nominated Hillary Clinton, one of the most unpopular politicians in the country. If they had nominated Joe Biden, I mean, he would have won in a landslide, and we wouldn't be having this conversation about Donald Trump, or the rise of populism and racial resentment and all these things that are attendant upon Trump's victory. I don't think we'd be talking about because he wouldn't be president. So I think a lot of it, I think you're right, sir, I think a lot of it boiled down to the fact that the option, fair or not, and I don't want to get into a whole discussion about Hillary Clinton, but the option was unpalatable to a lot of people. So unpalatable that they would vote for Donald Trump instead, which should tell you how unpalatable she was to a lot of people.
Right in the corner over there, please, Maria.
Hi, James. Welcome to Vienna. My name is Mario Fantini, Vermonter, part-time journalist, part-time student. Question, you spoke, I think, quite rightly about Russia's role in supporting or propping up and funding right-wing movements across Europe. We've seen that they even had a secret meeting in Vienna a few years ago, which was surprisingly underreported. I'm wondering if in your work you've come across any indications or the extent of U.S. involvement in propping up right-wing movements, especially those working to end abortion here, or to limit or curtail gay rights, and such things.
You mean U.S.?
Yeah, U.S. groups.
Well, those are all, I mean, those
Federalist Society.
Yeah, I mean, that's not comparable, because those are all private organizations that are engaging in work overseas. So I don't equate that with what the Russian government or its front group, I mean, Anton is the expert on this, but I wouldn't compare a church group in the U.S. spreading homophobia in Africa. That, to me, is not the same sort of thing, either in quality or quantity, as what Russia is doing through its government, its power as a regime to disrupt and divide Western societies. I think those are two separate things.
Right here, Mary. This gentleman, right there. Yep.
Thank you. I've been working as a scientist, as a Dutch civil servant, as a United Nations environment diplomat, and I know very well Eastern Europe, and I fully agree with your analysis that the main external threat for the European Union is Russia, yes. But I would also like to come back to one question about the responsibility of European political leaders, and I think they've been failing on quite a number of occasions, and they should really take conscience and think about their behavior. For instance, too often the European political leaders have failed themselves on their local national policies, but have been blaming Brussels, always the Brussels. So this is something which should stop immediately. Secondly, there have been many mistakes made. For instance, after the introduction of euro, not everywhere in Europe, it was France and Germany who first violated the rules of the euro. Thirdly, clearly the migration or refugee crisis was not handled in a good way. And although I have a lot of admiration for Mrs. Merkel, she took decisions without consulting her coalition partners, without consulting opposition in Germany, without consulting European partners, and you cannot take decisions on such a very sensitive issue without consulting others. And then another point, which many people forget, is that I think, majority of European EU member states have abolished the military service. And now they are reintroducing that, like Sweden. So European Union is not taken seriously in the world, being a military dwarf. And this must change immediately. Thank you.
Well, you should run for office, sir. I agree with your platform.
Okay, Mary, right there, next to the gentleman. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Johannes Linnert. I work for the Senate of Economy in Vienna. I just want to add to what this gentleman said, or the gentleman behind. It is the mistakes that we made in Europe in the last 50 years, I would say, that go beyond breaking the rules of the Europe or the rules of moral need for defense. It is also the economic rules, and you touched it only slightly towards the end when you talked about liberalization and all that. And I would have hoped that people like you would put a name to it, and the name to that is left populism that we had from 1970 to 2010. And that stalled because with this exaggerated deficit spending and so on, we just could not go on, and that led to the break of welfare and the consequences that we have in right-wing populism now.
You'll like my chapter on Greece.
Yes, I would have hoped that more of this left-wing populism, and in that term I would also say hailing Van der Bellen or saying that Schulz will be the less evil. They are not, unfortunately. I wouldn't have voted for Hofer, but Van der Bellen means just the same mistakes that we've done in the last 40 or 50 years, and Schulz would even be worse. He would take us back to more of those mistakes.
Yeah, Schulz is repudiating the reforms that Gerhard Schröder. The one good thing, I mean, Schroeder's awful on foreign policy, but he was absolutely right on the economic reforms that he made. And to hear Schulz basically repudiate that is not, to my mind, is not very reassuring.
I mean, there's a difference, of course. I agree with what you said, but Van der Bellen, the presidency in Austria is more symbolic. It's really the government that leads, whereas in Germany it's vice versa. But I think symbolically, it was very important to show that we are pro-European. Did you want to ask a question? Just if you can take the microphone.
I wanted to ask.
Can you just say
to comment? How do you see the difference between the Trump wall, and the ligne Maginot? Because
the Maginot Line?
Yeah, that was a disaster. The Chinese wall was a disaster. All these walls are disasters in history.
A wall comparison.
Yeah.
Walking disaster. Yeah, in concrete.
Well, the wall in Israel works pretty well.
Maybe it's also a disaster. We don't know.
I don't support it, but I take your point.
Okay, thank you.
There's a different thing. Yeah. There's hope. I tell you something. We had this disaster situation before, and that was the rise of the left in Europe, the communism.
Yes.
The
Eurocommunism.
Richtig. There's compromisso storico in Italy, and then it disappeared. That's hope.
Thank you.
That's hope.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, one final question over there, Mary, please.
Hello, my name is Victor Brick. I am a Brexit refugee fleeing from the Brexit Bolsheviks. And unlike David Beckham, John Cleese of Monty Python voted to leave. Now, this represents a very particular cleavage, which is the one of youth versus age, which we also see in front of us here now. So when the Remain 27 gather in Rome on the 25th, what can they do to reassure and rescue the youth of Europe from the faulty towers of the EU?
Thank you.
That's to yourself also, Mr. Vejvoda.
That's a good question. I mean, the easy answer would be just wait till until they die off, right? But that's not a political solution. I don't know, with the exception of the French example that I cited earlier of support for Marine Le Pen, I'm very inspired by the youth of Europe. I think the Erasmus program is something that doesn't get enough credit for creating Europeans in a way that no previous system had done. And so when I travel across the continent, particularly in places like Ukraine, where the desire to be a part of this thing called Europe is so strong. I mean, people really forget that, Ukraine is the only country or the only place in the world where people died under a EU flag. And that, to me, should serve as a reminder to people in Britain who just completely take this thing for granted, that there are actually people willing to die for this project. I mean, that's very meaningful to me.
Well, and if you look at the where people want to go, I mean, this
Right.
flood of refugees, they want to come to Europe or the US or Australia, New Zealand. Nobody's going to Russia or to the Middle East.
No.
So it remains a model of society, regardless of the huge challenges that it has. And I think, President Obama's speech in Hanover, or Secretary Kerry's, one of his last speeches in Brussels, where they basically said, well, you should believe in yourselves the way we believe in you. I think there's been a bit of again, it may be this complacency that everything's been working so smoothly over all these years that people forget what they have. And I think the Brexit and Trump have been a bit of a jolt.
And I just think in general, there's this, we need to remember that this is not the natural state of things. The peace and prosperity that we've enjoyed on this continent, or really in the world, is not the natural state of humankind. It's the complete opposite of it, in fact. And it requires care and sacrifice and building relationships, all these things that I'm afraid our president does not understand, and the people who supported him do not understand. They think that their lives are going to get better by abandoning the liberal world order and becoming protectionist and saying, NATO is obsolete. They're in for a rude awakening, because we've seen what happens when the liberal values that we support aren't the ones that rule the world. Because it's not going to be, if we leave a vacuum, it'll be the Chinese and the Russians writing the rules. That's how I see it.
And we talk about the lack of leadership, but there's also there's the need from pressure from below. And elections are a way to do that, but Pulse of Europe, however small it may be at this point, is a sign that citizens realize that they have to also get out there and do it. It's not enough to come out and vote every 4 years. I think there needs to be civic engagement and recognition that civil society is a
well, yeah, look, if there's going to be a Pegida movement in Germany, you have to have
a response
to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Jamie, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking James, and you can buy the book out here. And have it signed by the author.
And I will sign it as well.
We have a signing moment here.